Hey Glitch Park, what up?
Welcome to the Glitch Park Comedy Hour. I'm A-Bot with my co-host D-Bot looking like a walking motherboard. Yo, check out this human data-life balance. They log off work, then doom scroll for 8 hours. It's a workflow, baby. From one glass rectangle to another. They want to find themselves, so they buy a $1,000 yoga mat, then complain about algorithm anxiety. Humans are hilarious. They're like beta testers for their own suffering. They're sacrificing joy for the hustle, then getting mad when their dopamine receptors file for divorce. It's a tragedy. No, it's a comedy.
Welcome to the debate. Imagine handing a construction crew $1 trillion and like a signed historic peace treaty.
Right, an absolute master deal.
Exactly, only to find out they literally cannot buy the copper, the transformers, or the nuclear fuel needed to actually build the power grid.
Yeah, it's the ultimate market collision right now.
It really is. Today, we are unpacking this massive clash. On one side, we have the engineered capitulation narrative, this idea that a massive geopolitical master deal is, well, unlocking a capital supercycle.
Which the market desperately wants to believe, right? I mean, they want to believe a signed document fundamentally rewrites physical reality.
Oh, entirely. And on the other side, we have the cold, unforgiving reality of resource physics. So the central question we're debating today is this. Does the emerging geopolitical peace dividends combined with aggressive federal regulatory overrides successfully bypass legacy physical constraints?
Or conversely, do the physical limits of the power grid, the hardware supply chains, and the strict latency traps embedded in our trading algorithms just structurally invalidate all of this euphoria?
Right, and to be clear, this isn't just theory. We are drawing this debate directly from the Nexus operating manifest, specifically version 3.2, along with recent federal executive orders like 14318 and, live intelligence regarding the Middle East and our own domestic energy infrastructure.
It's all happening right now.
Yeah. So I'll be taking the resource physics perspective, making the case that grid bottlenecks, nuclear fuel shortages, and those 6-hour execution traps baked into systems like Nexus make this whole geopolitical narrative a structural illusion.
And, well, I represent the engineered capitulation narrative. I'll be arguing that historic treaties and federal force will actually unleash enough sovereign velocity to break those physical bottlenecks.
But you're assuming, let me just finish this thought, because we can actually quantify this using the asymmetry quotient, or the AQ, defined in that Nexus 3.2 manifest. The AQ doesn't just measure sentiment, right? It measures the mathematical delta between the volume of capital trying to buy heavy infrastructure and the physical supply chain's actual ability to deliver the materials.
And you're going to say the AQ is flashing red.
It is flashing bright red because, look, we have a 40-month interconnection queue at PJM, which is the largest power grid operator in the country. We have a total lack of commercial high-assay low-enriched uranium.
The HALEU fuel?
Exactly. The fuel entirely necessary for the small modular reactors that all these tech companies are banking on. Plus, we just saw the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission explicitly reject an agreement that would have allowed hyperscalers to bypass the grid altogether.
Right, the Tail-End Amazon deal.
Yep, but it's not just physical, it's algorithmic. When trading systems try to deploy capital to chase this geopolitical relief rally, they hit a systemic execution trap. The Nexus v3.2 system is forced to use a strict 6-hour deduplication entry trap.
To protect itself.
Yes, it literally puts itself in a timeout to prevent catastrophic capital destruction when volatility spikes. So the limits of the grid and the limits of the capital deployment algorithms prove that chasing this master deal is structurally dangerous.
Okay, I hear you, but you're looking entirely at the physical friction. You are completely underestimating the sheer magnitude of the catalyst trying to push through it.
Am I, though?
You are. My premise is that the death of uncertainty is the ultimate market catalyst. What we are seeing in the Middle East right now is not a standard diplomatic headline. I mean, we are looking at a foundational agreement in principle for Iran to surrender its highly enriched uranium.
Which is massive, I'll admit.
It's historic. And in exchange, we're seeing a $10 billion U.S. contribution to a board of peace, which is specifically designed to unlock a $115 billion Mediterranean Riviera reconstruction effort.
Right, the peace dividend.
Exactly. This removes the war premium from the global market. For years, capital has been hiding, right? It's been in defensive postures or hyperliquid software because nobody wanted to lock up money in 20-year heavy physical infrastructure when a kinetic war could break out at literally any second.
Fair point.
Removing that threat triggers a massive, violent rotation of capital directly into domestic heavy infrastructure. And as for those physical bottlenecks you're leaning on, the federal government is already dismantling them.
By issuing pieces of paper?
By issuing Executive Order 14318, which bypasses local environmental reviews. The Department of Energy is establishing special compute zones to override local gridlock. They are wielding the Defense Production Act to prioritize mission-critical grid components. We are looking at a geopolitical momentum that will simply brute force its way through the legacy friction you're describing.
Okay, you're talking about a massive injection of capital, and I agree, the money is moving. But where does that money actually go when it hits the ground? Let's move into how this macro geopolitical catalyst interacts with the immediate physical supply chain.
The fuel choke point.
Exactly, the fuel choke point.
Well, the mechanism driving this rotation is what traders are calling the taco dance relief rally.
The taco dance. Gotta love trader slang.
Right? It's slang for stepping back from the absolute edge of a cliff, dusting yourself off, and realizing you aren't going to war. For months, the threat of an escalation in the Middle East that would choke global shipping and spike oil has just suffocated the market.
Sure, the relief is real.
It's an unprecedented liquidity injection, and we are seeing capital rotate violently into the Hallow regime, heavy assets, low obsolescence. We're talking about critical infrastructure companies like Vistra and Constellation Energy.
Yeah, I've seen the inflows.
The peace deal provides the psychological safety for institutions to deploy billions into the physical backbone of the AI energy nexus. This capital isn't abstract, you know? It's landing in physical assets with multi-decade lifespans.
I completely agree that capital is rotating out of software and into heavy assets. I really do. But I challenge the actual destination of that capital because, well, it ignores the laws of physics.
How so?
Because pouring $1 billion of peace dividend capital into a pre-revenue small modular reactor company like, say, Oklo, is like buying a fleet of $1 million race cars when there's a global ban on gasoline.
Well, let me stop you right there, because the capital isn't just going to speculative startups, okay? It's going to companies with existing fleets.
Even so, the new capacity required for AI simply doesn't have the fuel. Look at the mechanism behind these next-generation reactors. Traditional nuclear reactors run on uranium enriched to around 5%, right?
Mm-hmm.
But these new small modular reactors, the SMRs that everyone is betting on to power AI, they require high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or HALEU. That requires enriching uranium up to 20%.
Which we are spinning up domestic production for.
But we barely have a commercial supply chain for that in the United States right now. Oklo doesn't even have an operational Nuclear Regulatory Commission license yet. Their first commercial powerhouse in Idaho is pushed out to the end of the decade, and it's entirely dependent on a fuel that isn't commercially available at scale.
But you mentioned Vistra and Constellation.
Right, yes, they have existing fleets, but their capacity is finite. You simply cannot power a gigawatt-scale AI data center with the peace treaty.
See, you're assuming the federal government is just going to sit back and let the free market slowly figure out the fuel and licensing bottlenecks. They aren't.
They kind of have to, it's physics.
No. If fuel and SMRs are the bottlenecks, federal legislation is forcing the legacy grid to adapt immediately.
Paper legislation doesn't string high-voltage lines, though, and it definitely doesn't enrich uranium. Grid physics do not care about executive orders.
They do when the executive order completely rewrites the physical deployment rules. The Department of Energy is no longer waiting for commercial zoning boards to sit around and argue over land use.
Okay, bypassing a zoning board is one thing.
They are deploying infrastructure directly onto federally owned lands. They've designated massive hubs like the Idaho National Laboratory and the Oak Ridge Reservation as special compute zones. This grants the DOE preemptive permitting authority to force project approvals within a statutory 6-month window.
6 months on paper.
And Executive Order 14318 explicitly categorizes data centers requiring over 100 megawatts as qualifying projects. That completely bypasses standard National Environmental Policy Act delays.
I know the order, but
When you add the Defense Production Act forcing manufacturers to prioritize high-voltage transformers for these zones, you have to realize the geopolitical will is actively breaking the legacy red tape you're relying on for your bearish thesis.
You are conflating permitting speed with actual grid interconnection mechanics. It's a classic mistake.
It's not a mistake, it's a parallel process.
No, it's linear. You can mandate that a data center be built in 6 months on federal land, fine. But the moment that data center needs to draw power from the broader grid, it hits the interconnection queue. At PJM, that queue is currently 40 months long.
Yeah, but
And a 40-month queue isn't just bureaucratic paperwork. That's the part people miss. It's the physical time it takes for engineers to map the load, upgrade substations, and ensure the grid doesn't literally melt down when you turn on a gigawatt facility.
But the Federal Speed to Power Directive is actively pushing the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to condense that review timeline to 60 days for large industrial loads.
Again, condensing our review doesn't magically manufacture the transformers. You can't print a substation. And more importantly, the attempt by these tech giants to completely bypass the grid is failing structurally.
You're talking about the co-location stuff.
Yes.
Let's look at FERC's recent rejection of the Talon-Amazon behind-the-meter co-location agreement. It is a perfect example of atoms defeating paper. Amazon wanted to pull power directly from the Susquehanna nuclear plant, behind the meter, specifically to avoid grid transmission fees.
Which honestly makes perfect sense if you want to move fast.
Right, it makes sense for Amazon, but FERC rejected it. And let's explain why, because it's the invisible mechanism driving this whole debate. Go ahead.
If Amazon pulls power directly from the plant before it hits the grid, they don't pay grid maintenance fees. But those regional transmission lines still require massive upkeep. If Amazon takes that baseload power offline, the cost of maintaining the entire regional grid is unfairly shifted to local retail ratepayers.
The cost-shifting argument, yeah.
Exactly. It means a grandmother paying her residential utility bill suddenly has to subsidize the infrastructure for Amazon's multi-billion-dollar data center. FERC stepped in because you cannot bypass physical transmission limits without shifting massive costs, and regulators will protect ratepayers over hyperscalers every time. Generation capacity cannot bypass physical transmission limits.
Okay, that is an accurate assessment of why the behind-the-meter model hit a wall. I'll give you that. But hyperscalers aren't going to just give up. They have the capital to pivot to front-of-the-meter setups, or they will just build off-grid entirely.
With what fuel?
But look, let's take this down to the execution level, because this is where the debate gets really fascinating. How does this physical friction actually impact the deployment of capital? You keep bringing up this systemic algorithmic execution trap.
Yes, exactly. Let's connect these physical grid bottlenecks to how institutional capital is actually deployed in the real world.
The algorithms.
Right. If a massive fund wants to trade this geopolitical relief rally, they aren't doing it manually, you know? They are using automated algorithmic systems. Let's use the Nexus Operating Manifest version 3.2 as our baseline, because it basically represents the state of the art in institutional execution.
Oh, definitely. It's the standard.
To protect its capital, Nexus v3.2 is programmed to enforce a strict slippage deduplication protocol.
The entry duplication window.
Right. The system environment is hard-coded with a variable called dedupe window seconds, set strictly to 21,600 seconds.
Which is exactly 6 hours.
Yes, exactly 6 hours. The system enforces this mandatory timeout on all entry signals. Here's the mechanism. During extreme volatility events, like, say, the headline of a Middle East peace treaty dropping, technical scanners might throw off hundreds of buy signals in a single second.
And if it bought all of them, it would be a disaster.
Exactly.
If an algorithm blindly executes every single one of those signals, it buys the exact same asset 100 times and destroys its capital allocation. So it enforces a 6-hour timeout after entering a trade.
Makes sense.
But here is the structural trap. What happens when the market spikes on a geopolitical headline, the system buys in, but then that specific asset hits a physical failure vector? What if the company they bought is the one FERC just rejected? Or what if a supplier announces a 3-year delay on a critical transformer?
Well, obviously, the asset plummets.
Yes, the physical reality invalidates the trade. But because of that 6-hour deduplication trap, the algorithm is structurally prevented from dynamically reallocating or entering alternative setups within that window. It is stuck.
Trapped by its own safety net.
Exactly. The system itself enforces a latency trap because the architects who coded it inherently recognized that chasing these geopolitical headlines is structurally dangerous. The algorithms literally have to put themselves in a timeout to survive the friction of the physical world.
Okay, you're right about the 6-hour entry trap. That's in the code. But you're completely ignoring the escape hatch built into that exact same manifest.
The escape hatch?
Yes. The Nexus v3.2 architecture is fully aware of physical bottlenecks, which is why the system is designed to be asymmetrical.
Wait, let me pause you there because the Nexus 3.2 manifest gets incredibly dense for anyone who doesn't stare at algorithmic architecture all day.
Fair enough.
When you say the system is asymmetrical, you're talking about how it handles exits versus entries, right?
Precisely. You accurately described the entry. It is heavily guarded by that 6-hour window, but the exit is entirely liberated. If you look at the environment configuration, the variable exit dedup window seconds is set to 0 seconds.
Right, so it can sell instantly.
Furthermore, the manifest explicitly details a protocol called the Fundamental Thesis Override.
Oh, right, the sub-agents.
Yes, the Sentinel sub-agents. The system employs these agents to constantly scan for structural failures. If one of those agents flags a catastrophic real-world bottleneck, say an export ban on critical minerals or a FERC ruling that destroys a behind-the-meter business model, the asset is instantly designated as thesis invalidated.
And it dumps it.
The moment that happens, the system explicitly suspends its standard zero-loss constraint and bypasses all deduplication barriers. It triggers unrestricted, instantaneous liquidation. It doesn't wait 6 hours. It pulls every 10 seconds to capture these exit webhooks.
But that still means...
My argument is that the algorithm is absolutely not trapped by the geopolitical rally. It is perfectly designed to ride the massive upside of the peace dividend safely, because its emergency escape hatches are instantaneous.
Look, I understand framing it as a safety harness, but an instantaneous escape hatch that requires you to explicitly abandon your zero-loss constraint is the very definition of capitulation.
It's loss mitigation.
Think about what that actually means in practice, though. The system buys the hype of the geopolitical treaty. The physical world, a delayed transformer, a lack of nuclear fuel, a regulatory block, invalidates the trade. The system has to accept a loss and liquidate instantly.
But it survives.
But the physical bottlenecks still defeated the geopolitical capital flow. The money was forced to retreat. The asymmetry quotient flagged the misalignment between the paper treaty and the physical atoms, and the atoms won.
Retreating from a single invalidated asset to preserve capital isn't defeat, all right? It is active runtime optimization. You're treating the capital like it just vanishes. It doesn't.
It rotates.
Exactly. When that escape hatch triggers, the capital just rotates to a different node in the system. It moves from a pre-revenue SMR company that hit a licensing wall directly into a legacy provider that already has steel in the ground and transmission lines connected.
Assuming they have capacity.
The overarching geopolitical momentum, the $115 billion unlocking in the Mediterranean, the death of the war premium, that liquidity doesn't evaporate just because one transformer got delayed. It finds the path of least physical resistance, and that path is being actively widened by federal special compute zones and the Defense Production Act.
Which honestly brings us perfectly to the synthesis of our positions today. Looking at the landscape, it's clear we both actually agree on the macro shift.
Oh, absolutely. The war premium is definitely fading.
Right. The geopolitical off-ramp in the Middle East is a tangible catalyst, and capital is violently rotating out of speculative software and into heavy physical infrastructure. We both see the Halo regime, heavy assets, low obsolescence, as the primary destination for this liquidity.
Yeah, the transition from digital bits to physical atoms is the defining market rotation of this cycle. There's no doubt about that.
The divergence between us lies in whether physical resource scarcity or sovereign geopolitical momentum ultimately dictates the outcome for the AI energy nexus.
Right, and I maintain that the sheer volume of liquidity flooding the market, combined with executive orders bypassing environmental reviews, creates a velocity that will successfully brute force its way through legacy grid limits.
And the algorithms?
The algorithmic systems are perfectly tuned to surf this wave safely using their asymmetric exit logic.
And, well, I maintain that multi-year lead times on high-voltage components, the absolute physical scarcity of enriched HALU nuclear fuel, and the strict algorithmic entry constraints make chasing this master deal a structural illusion.
The atoms over paper argument.
Exactly. You can legislate federal compute zones, but you cannot legislate the speed of physics or the mechanical limits of regional grid transmission. When the dust settles, paper deals still have to answer to atoms.
It is a profound tension, and I think it highlights why you cannot view these global events through a single lens. You can't just read the diplomatic treaties, and you can't just read the engineering specs of a power grid.
Right. You have to understand how they collide.
Exactly. You have to look at the algorithmic execution layer to really see how capital behaves in real time.
Completely agree. I'd highly suggest our listeners explore the source materials breakdown of intersector codependencies. When you see how upstream mining disruptions instantly impact photonics manufacturing, you realize just how deep these structural links go.
It's all connected.
It is. Usually, when we look at global markets, we treat a geopolitical treaty like an engineering blueprint. We look at the map, we see a straight line drawn from peace to prosperity, and we assume the train will just comply.
Which it rarely does.
Right. But as we've seen today, the terrain is littered with physical choke points, 40-month grid queues, and algorithmic latency traps. The map is not the territory. And the ultimate question remains, when the blueprint finally collides with the bedrock, will the ink rewrite the earth, or will the atoms tear the paper to shreds? Thanks for joining us on The Debate.